frustrated when lecturers would just appear and they would speak about their work and never give you any more context as to how they went about creating those opportunities or manifesting them. And for me, I find that like very frustrating, and that's the information that I find the most beneficial. So hopefully I'm going to address that today in the talk. So we begin in third year of BA photography. As Jasper just said, I went to Falmouth. I did that whole Cornwall experience, that kind of desolate landscape, small community of friends kind of thing. And for me, it was very important to trigger a way of thinking about the landscape over those 3 years. And it kind of culminated in looking at land art, photography, and time. And those 3 subjects were something that I focused on for my dissertation. And they became something which has become the anchor point for all the work I continue to do. Artists working in the 60s and 70s sought to revolutionize what we could know as performance or as sculpture. Those working with elements such as land, fire, earth, air. There are artists that revolutionize what we could do and know as of art. And for me, I embraced that because it was fascinating, but also because it could show me how to further my understanding of photography. I sought these pioneers to help address the inherent or the perceived lacking of photography, and that namely was photography's relationship to experience. So the first project I'll talk about is Aurelian. And Aurelian actually came out of a year out I took from uni. I had the opportunity to go to Africa, and I was traveling, taking pictures for a charity. And sort of alongside the work they'd commissioned, I was also making personal work. I was shooting in a very sort of lyrical documentary way, sort of similar to Alex Soth or Doug Dubois, that kind of type of photography. And after completing the work and coming back to Falmouth, I sort of processed through all the work, and I realized that just something wasn't resonating. I was very unenchanted by the medium and kind of disappointed by the images I had made, not because visually they weren't strong enough, but because they didn't contain a kind of atmosphere which I sought. And so that for me kind of triggered returning to the BA, changing my approach to photography through a failure of photography, and considering a more conceptual approach to image making. So Aurelian, quite simply, is the investigation into British butterfly houses. And they're butterfly houses which are like sort of based all around the UK. I sort of Googled them. They're in Plymouth, Manchester, and up by Liverpool. And for a long time, I wasn't really sure why I was interested in them. I just knew I had to go there. And so over like many trips, I would like drive to Plymouth. And on the route, I was like listening to podcasts, anything to do about photography or art. I was just sort of absorbing that information and using it to help work out why this site was interesting. After some time, I realized I was interested in this contained environment, this artificial space, the way an ecosystem is sort of maintained and existing within this dreary grey landscape, which was England. So here you had tropical flora and fauna. There was like this intensity and like almost tangible atmosphere in there with the humidity. And for me, that was like a way to re-engage or re-experience the landscape of Africa and that continent. And it became a way of continuing experience. The work employs sort of various color theories. I'm very interested in the nature of color and monotone as suggesting the reality of the image. And for me, the work goes on to question or say how photography is a reality itself. It's not just time, but it is space. It's a space we can occupy and move through. And so really the greenhouse became like the TARDIS in Doctor Who, where it was seemingly infinite and where you could access absolute time. Alongside the kind of visceral abstract works, I also made these contemporary sculptures. I call them cultural objects. And they're objects which I guess quite literally deal with this transference of space and place into another vessel. They're a way of me articulating my approach to the architecture. And now I look at them, I can see that they're about containing, and they're about how the image in the photograph contains. So really, it's a sculpture of photography. Rebecca Solnit also talks about in her book, The Faraway Nearby, she talks about the nature of heat in terms of memory. And she talks about heat and warmth as being associated to growth and decay, whereas cold and ice is to do with permanence, it's to do with a fixation. And if you consider photography, I feel like on that sliding scale, photography would normally be aligned to something like that's a fixed entity. But through this work, I wanted to embrace photography not as something devoid of warmth or movement, but with something which grows and changes as we do. So after doing all that work for about a year, I came to graduate, as you guys are starting to think about. And I chose to show 2 works for the free range shows. And I'm aware you guys aren't sure how that's going to go for you this year, but for us, we had the access to it. And we all as a year started really working out how we could best maximize that experience. And I think it's worth noting at the time, I was embracing all forms of photography. I didn't impose a hierarchy on what I was interested in. I was working as a wedding photographer and like a freelance commercial photographer. And through that, I built contacts. And one of those contacts I made was Budweiser Budvar. They were a Czech beer. And I thought, considering free range, like it would be great to have some beer, some alcohol for the show. And I also thought about how I could maybe approach them to pay for the framing, because obviously as a student, that's a very difficult financial burden. So luckily, after some negotiations, I was able to get some beer for our show for the opening night and also present the works how I wanted. And really, I think that began this way of reconsidering or weighing up all my options in terms of thinking wider about embracing opportunities. The show went ahead. Everyone was very excited, like as you are. We went up to London. The show was a great success, and because of the alcohol, I don't know if you've been to a grad show, you'll know that whoever has the most alcohol is where everyone culminates at the end. So we had sort of an exciting evening and lots of conversations, and we felt it went very well. Alongside the Free Range Award, I also was doing the usual sort of grad exploits, so applying to like the Must Enter prizes, and at the time it was the British Journal of Photography's Breakthrough Award. And I knew of it because I'd seen some previous like Falmouth alumni from the year above me applying for it and doing really well with their work in the magazine. And so I applied, and I wasn't interested about winning the award. I mean, I would have taken it had they given it to me, obviously. But I was very interested in getting the work positioned in the magazine and hopefully circulating. And so I went about the process and didn't hear anything. I didn't win anything to do with the award, but then I had contact from the editor. And the editor invited me to show the work in the magazine, and it was great timing because it was released at the same week as Free Range. So I kind of had this experience of a double whammy effect where new audiences could digest my work through like in the flesh or through the magazine in their own time. And those 2 kind of elements really helped towards the Free Range Awards and the prizes that were handed out. Like towards the end of the show, there's these awards that they give out to various like portfolios within the exhibition. and I had no prior thought that I would ever get anything. I was actually planning on going out for dinner. I wasn't planning on hanging around. But on the evening, I was awarded the free range prize for the best in show, which was a fantastic award. It came with £2,000, £1,000 print credit, £1,000 cash, and a solo show within 6 months of receiving the award. And so when it happened, obviously, I was like extremely happy. Had a great night, and then the next morning, my brain started to turn to think about how I could maximize the opportunity and how I could do the best I could, because I knew everyone in my cohort would love that prize, and so I felt a responsibility to push forward. Which leads me to Amori. So from the Free Range Awards, you would have seen that image Blue Parrot, and Blue Parrot was an image that did really well for me during the like the graduate rounds. You know, you often see singular images doing really well from certain photographers or artists. I think often like the graduate showcase is all about making one individual strong image, and that can carry a whole body of work. And for me, that image was the Blue Parrot, and I was very interested into as to why that blue image was becoming so seductive for my viewers, and why there was such an attraction. And I felt it was partly to do with my embrace of monotone images. I remember I was pushing against the kind of photography which was regularly like winning awards and appearing in magazines, and that was the social documentary work with a kind of, you know, like orange hues or like purple hues. That work you saw or see quite regularly was doing well, and I immediately wanted to push against it. And I think the contemporary photography world kind of responded to it, and I wanted to build upon that grounding. And whether I'd won an award or not, I'd planned to go to Japan. I'd saved up some money, put it aside to start working towards new projects after graduating. So which led me to think about making a blue project in Japan and working out how that could kind of combine into being a project. So Amori triggered my further investigation into the color blue throughout art history. And for me, like art historical references are integral to my process. I like to know who's come before me so I can, I guess, gauge my work against theirs, but also learn from them, and also maintain a healthy distance so I don't become too close to another's practice. And so, like, you're looking at the color blue, of course, Yves Klein is a phenomenal conceptual artist working in the 50s and 60s. Klein, as you may know, pioneered an international Klein blue, his own color. And in a gallery show in 1957 at Iris Clerc in Paris, Klein took the gallery, and what he did is he covered it in a pure white paint, and then he punctuated the space with blue canvases of various scales. And at the time, that was revolutionary, because previously galleries would be cluttered. Like if you went to the Royal Academy summer show, the space is often overwhelmed by images. But Klein sought to change our pictorial experience of the gallery to make it a more of an intimate spatial experience, where you have this a deeper relationship to the work you're viewing. And that, I felt, was something I would definitely employ within this project. Alongside Klein, I was very interested in Rebecca Solnit and her famous novel, A Field Guide to Getting Lost. Within that book, there's a chapter called The Blue of Distance. And The Blue of Distance is really a metaphysical musing on the nature of blue within landscape. If you've ever sort of stood on a hill or a mountain and you viewed the opposing mountains in the distance, you'll often see the landscape veiled in a kind of blue shawl. And that blue is just, well, quite simply, it's blue that has, it's light that's got lost to create blue within the atmosphere. And for Solnit and her writing, she kind of felt the blue was representative of longing. It was places you can never be and things you should always see from a distance. And for me, I felt for Amori, I'd bring that longing near into the world of the image. And lastly, I was looking at Hokusai. Hokusai, you may know him from his views of Mount Fuji, 36 views of Mount Fuji, quite a large sort of woodblock series, which is very well known. And I was interested in Hokusai for his use of blue as a pigment. At the time when Hokusai was making works, the Japanese borders were closed, and he had to smuggle Prussian blue in. And Hokusai used the blue not just as a way of emulating dawn, but as a way of representing the immortal nature of the landscape. In Japanese culture, they place a very significant meaning towards the landscape as something endless, timeless, and as something which is immortal. And for me, those ideas were like juggling around, and they're the things I carried with me to Japan. Here are some of the images I produced. Blue tree, forest V, and forest 2. So I'd like planned to go to Japan with a very broad project in mind, and that was actually to photograph many different things other than the forest. So cities, portraits, still lives. The scope was very open, and it was only when I returned back to the UK and again looked through my work had I realized the forest images had this amazing attraction, and they were far stronger than the other pictures. And so I naturally edited them down to create Aomori, which is blue forest. And if you think about the forest, it's a place also of sort of ancestral time. It's a place which you lose all sense of time passing. Like if you're in a forest, often you look up, leaves may obscure the sky, distances crumble inside a forest, and you're quite sort of left stumbling around. And those ideas of the forest as something ancestral and maybe out of time itself, I felt really worked well with the philosophies I built around blue and combined together. I also thought about how Martin Heidegger speaks about Leitung in relation to the forest. And Leitung is a space where anything can appear. And for me, I felt that like through the forest and the images, I was witnessing the appearance of image, but also the disappearance of the artist. I was submitting myself to the world and the realm of the color. And lastly, experimentally, I sourced blue glass from a church window in order to produce this work. And for me, it was important that the blue was a part of the material process of producing the work, rather than just an afterthought. For me, again, it's about this embrace and this belief. The camera was the bridge to that reality, and through the apparatus, we could enter the realm. So after producing that work, I returned, or actually I moved to London, and I started to think about how I could produce the exhibition I would dream of, and also more importantly, getting a job. And through winning the Free Range Award, I also luckily had won the Metro Imaging Award simultaneously. And so that meant I was speaking to Steve McLeod, who's the creative director of Metro Imaging. I was speaking to him a lot, and I was basically saying, like, Steve, oh, please, can you help me find a job? I'm looking, and I'm finding it difficult. So he kept an eye out for me until eventually he rang me up and he said, Alex, I've just heard from Michael Hoppen, and I was wondering if you could go see him because he's after an archivist. And I was like, definitely, I'll go. I went home, got ready, went to the gallery, and met Michael, and luckily got the job. What helped is that Michael Hoppen Gallery is a fantastic collection of contemporary and historic photography, and Michael specializes in Japanese photography as well. So I kind of had this mutual topic to riff off with him. So I think that led to him wanting to employ me. And when I was at Michael, I met lots of other sort of leading experts, and one of them was Susan Bright. Susan Bright is a well-known writer and creator. You may know her from her like art photography books. She came to the gallery to do a talk with one of the artists, and I remember thinking, like, I thought she was a great speaker, and I thought her ideas about photography kind of aligned with mine at a point, and I thought it'd be exciting to invite her to write the introduction to my Amori show. And so after a couple of weeks, I emailed her and I said, dear Susan, I really enjoyed meeting you, and I was wondering whether you'd be interested in writing the intro to my show. And I wasn't putting any pressure on it. It was purely from a point of view of, I'd like to share this, and I would love your support if you felt like you could give it. And so the weeks went by, and she replied and said, yes, of course, I'd love to do the show. And so I had her, this sort of established like force within photography, who was championing the work. And that was a really great turning point in terms of generating interest in the project, because I could email other people to be partners, and I would say, like, Susan Bright's done the introduction, and it became this like stamp of approval, I guess. Alongside the writer, I also looked at the financial elements of the exhibition, and so that led me to work towards writing an Arts Council application. And I don't know if anyone's ever done an Arts Council application, but it's possibly the worst experience of my life. It's this sort of grueling, tireless process where you have to question everything about your project, why you're doing it, how it will be disseminated, and why it benefits not just you, but the community around you. And so over a space of a month, after work in the evenings, I would sort of write the application and really push myself through the words. And luckily, I received £8,500 towards the exhibition. And I also applied to Art House Jersey, a smaller funding body, to receive a further £1,500. So together, I managed to get my hands on £10,000 to work towards the show, and to produce a kind of clean, clinical space that you would experience in like a central London gallery. I had envisioned my work exactly like that, and it was fantastic that I could actually produce that work. And I also was able to engage sort of graphic designers. A good friend of mine, Harry, who went to Falmouth as well to do graphics. I had the money to sort of commission him to work with me on the vinyl, postcards, and posters, and create all the marketing materials. And so, I could actually produce everything the way I wanted to. Before the show, I also went about drumming up as much press as I could. I've noticed it doesn't really matter if you have a show if people don't know what date it opens. So I used my contacts that I had created during the graduate Aurelian work to get interviews and kind of sort of short essays written on these platforms, which got the word out and people, to come to the show on the opening day. Here's some of the installs. So, cough. Sorry about that. So alongside the sort of just the physical exhibition, I also thought about activities which would engage and please the Arts Council. And this is kind of what helped me receive the funding. So I produced an In Conversation with Professor Steve McLeod. You can see there was only like 8 or 9 people who went to the exhibition. to do the talk, and I feel like I was so nervous. I had no idea what I was talking about, but it was a great experience to sort of dip my toe in the waters of speaking. And alongside that, I'd also commissioned on the left, you can see a performance, and it was a musical performance from a musician called Lorenzo Buggio, who was my flatmate. And Lorenzo produced a score which was in response to Yves Klein's Monotone Symphony. This was a piece that Yves Klein created in the 50s, I believe, where he asked an entire orchestra to play one note for about 40 minutes. And so what Lorenzo did was that he took that note, he extrapolated it out using synthesizers, and he created this kind of amazing meandering score where, when viewed with the photograph or when heard with the photographs, it activated the work further. And so what you had was this kind of experimental piece of music which began to sound like things that were occurring within the images. So like a waterfall or a boulder running down the landscape or a low rumbling from an earthquake. It became this kind of activated site and a performance which helped engage sort of other people. Like Goldsmith students came to the show, and it allowed my work to enter other art forms. And lastly, one of the greatest results of this exhibition was introducing myself to Vivian Gamble. You would have seen those invites that I had designed. I'd spent a long time working out who I was going to send them to. I knew I wanted to be bold and like introduce myself to people who I knew of. I appreciated their work or what they did, whether they were artists, curators, writers. And one of the people I sent an invite to was Vivian Gamble. So I sent her an invite with a letter, and I said, I really admire the work you do at the gallery, and whether you would like to come to the opening of my show. And so she received the invite and said she'd love to come, which was brilliant. And unfortunately, I remember thinking on the opening night, like I was looking around to see who was there, but she never turned up. And I was kind of disheartened by it, but I felt it was worth pursuing. So I emailed her on a Saturday and I said, would you like to come for a private walkthrough with me on the Sunday? And she accepted, and then luckily she came along. We spent about an hour talking about the work, but also about art and life in general, opening ourselves up to see basically who each other were. And that led to some new opportunities and a great ongoing collaboration. So after the Amori show, about a week later, I had a phone call from Vivian, and she asked me whether I'd like to be represented with the gallery at Unseen. And for me, I was like 100%, definitely would like that. It's just the sort of place I would envision my work being positioned. For those of you who haven't been, Unseen's a very experimental fair. With Photo London, you get like sort of the broadest scale of photography, so sort of like fashion or reportage or kind of like old documentary photography. But Unseen, it's really a place for emerging artists, those sort of pushing the boundaries of photography into the expanded field. And it was the place that I would love to have my work seen, and I did, luckily. When I was in Amsterdam, I sort of had to develop this another way of being for my practice, which was working with a gallery, trying to negotiate how those relationships work. It seems like I'm constantly learning. There are constantly things I don't know and have to discover. And I feel like you'll come across that, or you probably already have. It's ongoing learning. And as soon as you embrace that, I feel things become much easier. And I didn't know whether to, how formal should I be? How informal should I be? How does this relationship work? But luckily, through the experience, we got to know each other. And I learned all the things that an artist has to do within that situation. So like schmoozing, and giving talks. I think I gave about 15 artist talk to collectors. They came into the booth. I discussed the works and my background and why I'm interested in being an artist. And for me, the whole experience was a great success. I challenged myself, and we also sold well. And so I left Amsterdam with this like pool of money, which I was going to put into further future projects and also like paying rent, practical concerns. So after Amsterdam, I came back to London and I enrolled at the Royal College of Art. Um, I got in, which was great, and I started to consider what it was I wanted to push within my work. And now I'd had the time and the experience and like some success with some projects, and considering my thesis and sort of subjects within that. But the main thing which sort of distracted me for the first year was this message I had from Emma Boker. And so Emma Boker is the director of photography for the FT Weekend, so the Financial Times. And she's funnily someone that I sent an invite to my Mourant exhibition. And so I'd made the introduction, but nothing had come of it yet. And I think Emma had seen my work shown with Scene 15, and she knew I was living in London. And so she invited me in just on Instagram to come for a coffee. And I was very excited and also a bit like, oh God, I don't know where this is going to go. But I went to the meeting. I wore my heart on my sleeve, and we started speaking about photography over like many hours. And I realized that we had a very similar appreciation for certain types of photography, and we really like riffed well. When you have that connection with someone about artwork, it's kind of an excited feeling you get afterwards. That's the kind of experience we had. And she commissioned me then and there for the Financial Times Photo London Commission, which is a commission that's given out to 4 artists a year. And broadly, it's about considering your relationship as an artist to be living in London. And it's a very broad commission. You can respond to it however you'd like. And so I left immediately excited, but also daunted, because previous artists that have done the commission include Idris Khan, Tom Lovelace, Daphne Talma, Gillian Waring, some like very established artists. And I immediately felt, as always, is that I didn't want to disappoint the commissioner. I wasn't in direct competition with those artists. It was more about living up to the work and seeing if I could produce work under those sort of conditions, which for me was an entirely new departure. So I began the commission, and one day I was walking from High Street, Kensington to Hyde Park. The RCA campus is just underneath Hyde Park. And as I was walking, I came across this amazing excavation of the road. I think it was like 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, and like 3 meters down, or even further. And the excavation immediately reminded me of Michael Heiser's Double Negative, the colossal earthwork from the Nevada desert. And it's an earthwork which questions the nature of absence and presence within the landscape. It questions deep time within an artwork, and I guess inverted space. And so I encountered this real world situation which echoed an artwork, and it triggered a thinking about the material from the site, where the material had gone, and what this depth would mean for maybe experience and memory. I started to think about how many times had I walked along the pavement, and generally, like if I walk through a doorway, if there was a counter, what would the number be? I was thinking that maybe in this work, material would absorb passing and would be a vessel for like continuous movement. And so those works that work triggered this way of thinking for the commission. Alongside Michael Heiser, I was also looking at the Ball family. They make these amazing surface works that deal with like casts made in like industrial areas and rural areas all around the world. And it's interesting if you consider it in terms of like surface and photography. And for me, within the work, I was thinking about depth and three-dimensionality. And so how would I address three-dimensionality within a two-dimensional medium? There was this friction, and using these references helped me approach and reconsider what the results could be. So here's the piece I created for the FT. I decided to look at certain areas in London which had personal significance, and whether those areas would ever have excavations going on, so sort of like roadworks. And I chose to focus around my uncle's flat. He has a flat sort of in the outskirts of London. And for me, that's kind of like the ground zero of my mental mind map of the city. And I felt it would be the place of the most significance for me in terms of thinking about passing it over space. And so I visited the street where his flat's on like many times and didn't get anywhere until one day, luckily, there was an excavation. And so I collected the material that had come from underneath the earth, underneath the road, and I took it with me back to the darkroom. And in the darkroom, I'd placed a giant, like large glass fish tank underneath an enlarger. And what I'd created was a wooden 9-panel frame. And within that 9-panel frame, you could place 9 large format negatives. And so what I would do is that I would slide the negatives underneath the fish tank, fill the fish tank with water, and then I would performatively gesture the material I'd harvested into the tank. And what occurred was these amazing sort of like dissipation of weight of material, so like sand and like heavier rock and rubble. And it created these abstract shapes that moved along the glass panel, and also just being suspended in the water. And so for me, it became this artwork which performed my experience of material, but also of photography and photography's relationship to architecture. Alongside the FT commission, Emma also very graciously curated me into Peckham 24. I don't know if anyone's been to Peckham 24, but it's a very, again, like experimental fair. It's not really for selling, like there's no commercial viability there, but it's for creating dialogues with artists who don't just do photography, but also do performance, and they may be writers. It's a place or a creative hub to experiment. And so it was a fantastic place to be invited to exhibit in. And the artists also included in the show were some of my favorite artists working. So Marion Bourmier, Tenzing Dagpa, Maya Daniels, Katrin Koning, and Raymond Meeks. And again, I had this imposter syndrome where I was of course really excited to be in the space and to participate, but again, there's this problem that of making sure the work's good enough, I feel. And so what I felt I would do was make something site specific, something really embedded in the space and the location of the exhibition. So I chose to make a work which adapted my FT process for working with material from Peckham. So I chose to excavate work from like Rye Lane, and if anyone's ever been to Peckham within the last few years, you'll see that Peckham's going under a lot of gentrification. The area's changing and renewing, and for me, it felt quite poignant to take material, put it through my process, and then represent it in the location as a kind of doubling. And I think broadly the work comments on the nature of the city as an organism, as something which constantly changes and moves, You know, buildings are constantly being constructed and deconstructed, and it's something which is active. And so the work, when represented, addresses the nature of material being separated, but also the way images are separated through pauses of time. There's a interconnected feeling where the materials move over this negative space, which actually is reminiscent of Michael Hyde's double negative. But it's about images and time and the fluctuation of experience. Here's some of the installs from the show. So the show was really well received, and Vivian, who I spoke about earlier, is also the founder and director of Peckham 24. And so she had seen the work that Emma had curated, the sort of like little section where it was my work and Marianne's, and she felt it was a really great critical curation, and it's something that she invited both of us to show at Unseen 2019. And so what happened is that we had my work, which dealt with geology, and Marianne, who is a Norwegian, she's a Norwegian artist, and her project explored like mining in rural Norway and the political connotations going on there. And both our projects kind of riffed off each other in a way where the previous Omori work was kind of, I guess, much more accessible. And I feel like it was interesting because this show engaged more writers more. I remember Duncan Waldridge came into the space and we had a great conversation about the work. And again, it was this movement of the work, the meeting of peoples, and how, I guess, opportunities arise and being aware of them and grasping them when they occur. Because of time restraints, I can't speak about any other commissions I've done, but I've also did work for the Greatest magazine and also a property development company recently this year, where I produce editorial but also artwork commissions. And maybe if we have time at the end, whoever wants to hear about it, we could speak about it. So the main body of work I've been thinking about over the last 2 years at the RCA is I Could Not Tell Glass from Air. And it's a body of work which I'm still wrapping my head around and learning to articulate. It's something which pushes and pulls me away and continuously confounds me. And I guess it's easiest, the best way to describe it is to start at the beginning. Again, it's greenhouses. With Arulian, it was butterfly houses. With I Could Not Tell Glass from Air, it's greenhouses. But they're abandoned greenhouses based in Jersey. And they're old agricultural sites where flowers and sort of tomatoes were grown. It was during the booming agricultural era, during the 50s and 60s. But due to like various economic downturns and the 1979 oil crisis, the greenhouses fell into disrepair and essentially became this ruinous site. And for me, over like 5 years, I've always driven past them, and I was always interested in them for something, again, I couldn't articulate, and it was something to do with the sculptural potential of the work. And so I began exploring that. Here are some of the pictures I started producing. When visiting the site, I really started embodying the camera and seeing as camera. I realized, you know, these pictures are very like focus intensive. They deal with these kind of like enclosed spaces. And through looking and seeing as a camera, I began to create these analogies between the medium and the architecture of the site. The site's architectural playbook has been sort of rewritten because there's no longer those concrete distinctions between here and there, interior and exterior. So it became this place that had ruptured, that no longer had distinctions and was essentially an in-between site. It was a place of liminality. And when making the pictures, I realized that, photography too functions in a similar way. There's me here, and over there, there's the subject. And what do I place in between those two things but the camera? And moreover, the photographs, the children of cameras, they exist in this kind of half-life state. I think Roland Barthes speaks about the living death-like qualities of photographs, and Susan Sontag speaks about photography as a twilight art. As you know, twilight is in between day and night. It's something which is neither here nor there. And for me, I felt like I'd realized over 2 years that that's what photography was, and that's what the architecture was teaching me, that they both were liminal. Over the 2 years, I only produced 8 successful photographs. It goes to show how demanding I am of the images I produce. And I continue to research sort of like land art and like early conceptual practice to further understand what the site could mean. And a groundbreaking moment for me was watching Robert Smithson, the great land artist, producing glue pour. And it's the middle top work you can see there. And Smithson speaks about entropy within his work. And entropy is the kind of availability of any system to decay or change. It's kind of like the randomness of anything that has energy. And Smithson was talking about entropy in relation to Marcel Duchamp, and in particular Marcel Duchamp's The Large Glass. And if you don't know this work, it's a colossal, famous piece of conceptual art. And Smithson spoke about Marcel Duchamp's The Large Glass in terms of Duchamp moving the work before an exhibition. Duchamp carefully packaged his artwork and sent it in transit. And whilst in transit, the work cracked. And ironically, Duchamp viewed the cracked glass, and then he finally felt that it was finished after working on the piece for just under 10 years. And what was interesting is that Smithson felt Duchamp's attempt to overcome entropy by packaging it was actually limiting the work. And really it opened up this realization that everything is moving within space, and the greenhouse too is something which is transforming. And if art is something which changes, then the greenhouse is literally art unfolding in front of my eyes. So that became a kind of like mind-blowing moment for me, alongside thinking about the relationship between function and object. So this glass which I drink from has a function, which is to hold water. But if it's broken, it no longer has that function. So what does it become? I believe we place limitations on things through the veil of function. And when things are liberated from that designation, they enter a realm of like higher potential. And that was the sort of the greenhouse, and this object, large object, admittedly, entering a place of otherness. And alongside those ideas, I was also looking at Derek Jarman and Agnes Varda, whose work questions photography and cinema as analogies to greenhouses too. So last year I was also hit with the dreaded COVID, like everyone was. And I was hit at the time when I too was about to graduate from my MA. And it hit me hard, as it did everyone, because we felt like we were working towards something which would be a big moment for us, a way of introducing the work to the industry that we've been working on for the past few years, and hopeful to generate new interest. And the physical show was taken away from us, and I started to think about how could I use alternative methods to present the work. And what I thought I would do is that reach out to a good friend of mine to start producing renders of an exhibition. And I think you'll see that as like a thread running through all of my work, and that's like collaboration. It's realizing that there are many other methods and tools at your disposal, but often other individuals have those skills. And so by collaborating, you can embrace and hopefully like mutually progress. So I asked my friend Connor, who's this designer, whether perhaps we could actually build an environment which would be to my exact specification and scale, to create some kind of experience of the work spatially as a show. And he agreed. And so what I did is that I sat down on this desk, and on the left you can see the sketch. And I was envisioning, like, right, if I walked in, on the left there would be that work, directly in front of me would be that work, and then down that wall 90 degrees would be the long grid work. And so I kind of built up the exhibition that way. And I kept on like working on it and driving them insane because it wasn't right. Frames are too big, frames are too small. And we pushed it until we produced the work. So here are some of the installs that I showed. And I use these materials for like Instagram and newsletters and like social media and just general emails. And what was interesting was how like some very like seasoned academics actually like messaged me asking whether they could go see the show. They were like, wow, like these are great, good job, you know, considering COVID. And I think it goes to show that like the currency installation images hold within the art world, and how being able to experience or imagine artworks as objects is integral to your practice. I feel like this is definitely something I'd always speak about with students, and that's the objects are what you make in the end of the day. It's about manifesting something in the physical world. And from a commercial point of view, if you want to sell an object, it's much easier for someone to experience that through an install than just saying, oh, well, it's going to be this, this, and this, because that's all well and great, but it's hard for someone to imagine. And also in terms of like creative development, curators look at install shots to understand how works may occupy a space and be informed with other work surrounding it. And so for me, it was really integral that this work I was actually conveyed in that way, because it's so important to me, the scale and the texture of the works. Here's one of the largest pieces I've ever made, and it's called A Gesture of Brambles. It's a 18-panel grid work, which is made from harvested glass panels from the greenhouses. And it functions as a direct index. So previously, you know, the photographs I showed, they present an expanded version of space of that site, but here you had a one-to-one index. It was a way of transposing like the physical scale of the site into the gallery for a viewer to walk along and around. You know, as the maker, I'm the only one that's ever actually experienced the site with my body. And as viewers, we use our bodies as registers to understand objects too. And for me, the works with the photograms began this sort of dialogue about translating the mathematics of space into a gallery. It's kind of a development onto the Feel It's Touch work, where it deals with touch both as a subject matter and in its creation. So you can see this durational gesture over time, which has been made on moss on the panels, is also echoed through like the way I produce the work. So a photogram is made through touch. And also Teju Cole speaks about the nature of touch as one of the only reflexive senses. So I can see without being seen, and I can hear without being heard, but to touch is to be touched. I touch this table and the table touches me. And those kind of ideas were sort of floating around the work, and hopefully they're still contained within it. Lastly, Shelter is one of the largest pieces I have ever made, if not the largest. I don't know how many panels it is, actually. I think it's like 38 panels. And it is a real great example of using this kind of rendered environment to present works in a way which I'd never be able to afford to do in real life. I think I worked out that this piece would cost me about 20 grand to produce, like to mount the prints and to tray frame them. And ordinarily this work, exists in a portfolio box under my bed. But through the render and the embracing of this alternative process, I was able to create a realistic experience of the work for anyone wishing to see how the piece would function in real life. And like on the left here, you can see how the frames are very specifically placed, and that's the exact distance the panels have from the greenhouse. And even down to the 5mm gap between the mounted print and the edge of the aluminium frame, that's all accurate. And so, it's an interesting tool, and I think it's interesting to point out how I wouldn't have been forced to have done that had I not been pushed by COVID. And I think, it's easy to say, oh, I had a friend that could help me with it. But there are many ways of doing things and approaching things, and there is no one set path. And I think it just goes to show that as artists that think on your feet, you can make the best of an opportunity, whether it's a bad opportunity or a good opportunity. I'm not sure how long I've been going for, but I've just got a couple of things to add. I'm now also a member of Revolve Collective. We're a group of 7 artists that run open calls, workshops, exhibitions. Our remit and our goal is to bridge the gap between students and early career artists to sort of mid-career artists. We prize education and alternative methods of pedagogy to teach photography and writing, essentially. And I got introduced to the Revolve guys through my own practice, but also through an artist called Victoria Doyle at the RCA. And I'd met Victoria on the course, and she was someone that I really resonated with. We got photography. And she designed a reading group in the evenings. And one of the people she invited to the reading group was Krasimira, who's one of the co-founders of Revolve. And so what happened is that we got together to basically be vulnerable, to share our favorite reading and what we felt about the work. And through that collaboration, I built up a relationship with Krasimira as well, until the whole Revolve team invited me to join. And what I've learned is that I, as an artist, have weaknesses and I also have strengths. And together we can share and sort of become fully rounded artists. And that's really what Revolve's been teaching me over the past year. I've got some cringy tips to help you guys if you're willing to listen to them. The first one is to think of yourself as an artist, not as a student. I think that's a really important one, and I think it's a very big psychological barrier. It's something Grayson Perry speaks about in his Wreath lecture series. And I remember graduating and being sat with my family around a table, and they were kind of so what are you gonna do? And I knew I wanted to be an artist. I just couldn't bring myself to say it, because maybe I felt I wasn't there yet and I wasn't ready. And I think there comes a time when you do feel ready to use that word, because it's quite a big word, it's like a status in a way. And I think it's important to start believing it, especially if you're graduating or doing an MA or something like that, because it shows you respect yourself, and also you respect your work. And I think that's what the industry responds to. Number two is read, 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 and then read some more. I think that's probably one of the most important things ever. Reading is for me everything. It is the light at the end of the tunnel. Reading is a way for me to expand my world. And I mean, when you start to understand the theory of writing and things like that, words and images are the same. So if you wanted to like work out what images you should be making, why don't you consult a library of images? Number three is peer-to-peer learning and embraces the exchange of skills. I've mentioned that throughout the talk, people I've worked with who's helped me with their skills, and I also give back whenever I can for this kind of mutual growth. Number four is use social media to build relationships with like-minded artists. I think that's very important as well. I think probably I wouldn't have done about 50% of the things I've done had I not used social media. I use Instagram in a healthy way, I think. It's about promoting artworks that I like and enjoy. It's about sharing reference. It's about learning about what shows are coming on, published. And it's about the community around myself. As photographers, you have specific interests and specific ways of being. And I feel when you start sharing that and maybe being vulnerable, it attracts like-minded people. And sometimes those people are the ones that can provide you with opportunities, and vice versa. Number five is be selective with features, be engaging, be consistent, and be polite. I'm a firm believer that people only work with the people they like, so don't be a dick. And yeah, it's very self-explanatory. Number six, if you open doors, keep them open. It's tough, but try. My dad always says that I am very good at like making introductions and having that initial back and forth. But what I struggle with, especially like during COVID, is keeping up with people. I'm a naturally introverted person. It drains my energy to speak with people over an extended period of time. But it's a good practice to be in. Just like a little email to say how's it going, it can really like make the difference. Number seven, maintain high visual standards and produce great install shots of your work. I mean, we're all artists who are visual. I can go through a website in like a minute and I can know whether it works for me or not. You know, you need to create that consistency, whether it's a lecture like this or an Instagram post. And that may seem very obvious, but you know, it's surprising how a lot of people don't know that. Number eight, always have something to work towards. At a grad show, there's always that annoying person going around who's like, so Alex, what are you working on next? And sometimes you may have just poured your whole heart and soul into a piece and you really can't even imagine making anything ever again. But you need something to respond to that person. And it doesn't have to be something major, like I'm working towards my major solo show. It can be something simple as like producing a zine, something which keeps your practice moving and makes people excited to follow you, I guess, or to keep up with your work. Number nine is have a good website that works, preferably with your own domain and email address. I really hate .pix, .wix, .cargo. I don't mind sites that are made on those accounts, but that have the domain .cargo or whatever. It just feels unprofessional. And if you can, you know, like work towards your own domain and also having an email which doesn't have excessive symbols, just clean and simple. I feel like it's all about the psychology of communication, and there are accepted ways of doing things, and it can help, you know, progress your career. And number 10 is there are no rules. I'm a firm believer in following my own mind. If I disagree with something, I'll disagree with it. I think I've provided some examples of things which, if you want to absorb them and take them, they could be beneficial. But also, if you did completely disagree, then great, good for you. You do that. There is no right formula in this process, and I think it's great to embrace bits and pieces from many different people. I'd just like to speak about internships briefly. When I was in second year, I worked with Nadav Kanda, and in third year, I did some work with Simon Roberts. Both were very interesting experiences, and I learned a lot about what the industry was like. I learned that maybe assisting isn't for me, and that's not a reflection on these artists because they're both phenomenal photographers and artists. There's this kind of pressure involved, and sometimes, you know, it's suited for you and sometimes it isn't, but equally, it's always an experience which you can learn from. Here's some suggested reading and seeing. I'd encourage you to take a screenshot or something. I probably haven't spoken about books as much as I wanted to today, but as I said, please keep expanding what you see and know. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
Ooh,
am I on mute? No. Cool. That was really comprehensive, and I found it super interesting. So, just want to say another massive thanks for taking the time to present that.
No worries.
To see the, I mean, certainly for me to see, you know, everything from like your conceptual process there to like things you were considering, you know, when paying the rent. There was like, I thought it was really cool to hear it in that kind of entirety. So I think we've probably got, you know, maybe 15 minutes. So Isaiah's put a message on Instagram there, and I'm just reminding anyone listening that they can pop a question in either chat box if they've got one. In the meantime, I've certainly got a couple of questions that I was going to put to you, Alex, and and I guess some are more specific than others. Maybe a more general one, just in this window, is to see your trajectory there as an artist from some of the work you'd done before you graduated to what you're doing now. It's certainly evolved and, you know, and grown a lot. And I'm curious to hear, you know, do you have any thoughts on the affinity you feel as an image maker to specifically the medium of photography, as you work kind of more with photograms now, and you were showing some works there that are not kind of specifically lens based. So I suppose perhaps in terms of your identity as an image maker, what sort of like loyalty, I guess, you feel to photography as a medium?
That's an interesting question, like loyalty to the medium, because like, why do we have to be loyal? I mean, generally, like, loyalty is like drummed into us that it's a good thing. And I think photography will always be my foundation and my anchoring. It's the way it's my conceptual introduction to the world. And I'm always interested in artists that use a medium as their foundation but don't actually like actively use the medium, if that makes sense. So like sculptors that came from photography are generally like some of the most interesting sculptors because they use their understanding of space through photography to inform their practice. And I think like, there's this, you can definitely see this shift. If I was making if I was making that greenhouse project again, I don't think I would start with the camera. But again, like, the camera is how I came to understand the site and grow my understanding of the architecture. But I will not be producing like photographs for them as art again anytime soon. I've really drifted into cameraless, and I spoke to you briefly about the thing I was working on last year, which is much more like performative based. And I guess it's like maybe I've got what I need from just the act of making pictures, and now I've moved on to handling images as a material themselves, and and thinking about images in alternative ways other than photography.
Sweet, yeah, I think that's super interesting. I mean, you mentioned something during that talk about, I wrote it down, it was the veil of function, and like I think you were talking about the greenhouse as a subject there, weren't you? But it kind of, to me, resonated in the trajectory you described with photography itself, actually. I guess like seeing the image, less as a kind of thing in itself, and perhaps more as a vehicle to access these like bigger ideas.
Definitely. And I feel like, I always champion photography because I feel like photography is the most underrated medium, but is actually the most interesting medium. It's the most like new medium, if you just count digital art, in the history of like mediums, and because of its like everyone's inherent bias towards photography or prejudice, they just assume photographs are what they are. It kind of like slips under the radar, and actually when you start to consider it and understand how it proliferates everything, I feel like you get a much more appreciation for like the potential of photography. And also photographs are photography is the easiest way of producing images other than reading. And in a world that is constantly concerns itself with like the manipulation and the distortion of images, surely we're best suited to like to creating this dialogue and to help navigate where we are now.
Sure, yeah.
Rather than someone throwing paint on a canvas. Like painting's dead.
Yeah. It's old. I guess 200 years is a big number, isn't it? But in the grand scheme of things, compared to most other art forms, that's pretty young, isn't it? For photography. I think that's right. Is it 200 years? Like 1800s?
1820. Yeah.
There's a question from Emma that's just come through here, which says, thanks, Alex. Really interesting talk. When presenting your work, what thought do you put in regarding the materials? Have I read that right? When presenting your work, what thought do you put in regarding the materials you use? For example, the environmental impact / interaction of creating physical prints.
Broke up a bit there. I got materials in terms of environmental impact and prints. Is that right?
When presenting your work, yeah. Sorry, I may have kind of stuttered. So what thought do you put in regarding the materials that you use? And yeah, as an example, the environmental impact / interaction of creating physical prints.
Okay, that's a good question. And I guess it puts me in a difficult spot because I guess up until now, considering the environmental impact of my prints on the work I make hasn't been in my mind. I guess I've been interested in actually trying to fulfill the ideas, and then once I've got there, then I can like reconsider what my impact is as an artist. So I guess I'm constantly readdressing what it is I'm doing, and I'm very aware of like Land Art Collective. They produce these amazing bioprints and like with alternative chemicals and processes and stuff to be less harmful to the environment, which is maybe something I should be considering. And the other question, right, was about like how much prior thought do I have in terms of the materials, right, of the finished works?
Yeah,
a lot. The entire artwork is made in my head before I even begin it. I know I even know the position of the install shot I will take before I make the work. I'm a very like premeditative person, and also like in terms of resources, I don't have the time or the money to just make works that aren't good. Like I feel like I consider very rigorously what these materials are, how they'll work together, and how they'll help emphasize or support my project conceptually. but also like materials that are also like economic for me at the time. I'm very interested in like working with steel and metal more. It's so expensive, and so recently I've started working with wood. Wood's something that I can use myself. Like I can cut it, I can screw it, and I guess that's me leaving university as well, and having to think about ways of making work within my means.
Yeah, cool. That certainly resonates with me actually. The way you kind of touched on your creative process there. I guess it wasn't what I'm about to ask is not the thrust of Emma's question, but it's interesting to hear that how premeditative you are, and like, so it's not as though you're drafting like various iterations of an idea before it's constructed. If that makes sense.
I draft it in my mind.
Yeah.
I'm like familiar with the materials from having worked with them before, so I feel like I know how far I can push a material, or an idea. And I guess it just comes from experience of working with the materials. You can't substitute that experience or that time, can you?
Sure. So yeah, if no one else has any other questions, I think we can probably leave it there. How about Instagram, Isaiah?
Yeah, no, Instagram. There are no questions as of now on Instagram.
Cool.
Maybe I'll just end off this call, but maybe a comment like / question. I think it's, yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. It's such like a robust talk, and I think I particularly like how you mentioned, especially with the latest work. You're saying that you're still trying to like learn how to articulate the work, which I think especially in the university sphere, you're always constantly like, you have to like kind of like know what your work is about, but actually the matter of fact is that your work is something that's organic and something that is so-called breathing, and it's something that you are slowly learning how to articulate and all. I maybe I just want to like kind of jump back about the series they do. I think it's Amori, the one of the blue landscapes, and you talk about how like I think Japanese landscapes and how especially people from Japan view the landscape as something as of like a spiritual body. I think really my question, or something that you might want to add on, is like, is there any like particular like Japanese like aesthetic philosophy that you are particularly like informed or that you relate to?
I was interested in. Thanks for your question, Azar. Are you aware of like the philosophy of kami? The idea that kami are essentially spirits, but like that's a very restricted understanding of what they are. They're essentially spirits that provide in like the fabric of reality for Japanese culture. I'm not an expert, but I'm aware like kodami or something are the spirits which reside within forests. So they're within trees or within moss. And yeah, I guess that relates heavily to Shinto and Shintoism, that religious belief. And the thing with the church glass, I realized when Susan wrote the text about my work, is that the religious history of the church glass in relationship to the religion in Japan, and this idea that the color was also embodying that and pulsating through the images, as this kind of like undertone of worship. I guess it became about like the obsession of image as well. But yeah, in terms of, there's like wabi sabi, that classic thing, which I'm sure everyone knows. Adam Jepsen utilizes it very well, with his like sculptures and cyanotypes in tanks. And the other one is Ma, which I like. I like the idea of Ma, which is not the arrangement of things, but the space around things. So they use Ma when Japanese flower arranging. So instead of arranging like which flower goes where, you're actually arranging the negative space around the vase and the plants. So that's interesting in terms of like not looking at the thing, but looking around the thing. which I think, yeah. So I drew on those.
No, yeah, that sounds beautiful. I think there's a thing about Japanese philosophy that's so wholesome.
Mm.
You know, looking at things in a very like alternate way, and yeah, something I really appreciate as well.
But also, like, Japanese history with photography is like very revolutionary and destructive at points. You know, like Moriyama's goodbye photography was groundbreaking because it was pushing against like direct visual ideas of photography. And also, you know, you're like Daisuke Yokota now with like the destructive material, working with photography. And another one is Mayumi Hosakura, who's a big reference for me in terms of monotone images. So yeah, there's definitely an amazing history of photography in that country, and something it's nice to sort of engage with.
Oh, cool. All right, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it at here because we have a upcoming presentation next at 3. So,
Great, cool.
Thank you very much, Alex, for spending your Easter bank holiday afternoon with us.
No worries. Well done, guys, and like hope you enjoy the rest of your program.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Cheers. Thanks for the invite.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.